You need to understand something before I tell you this story. There are places in this world that should remain empty. Houses that should stay abandoned. Doors that should never be opened. The Pritchard house was all three, and when my great-great-grandfather's family moved into that cursed place in the spring of 1842, they broke a silence that had lasted for 7 years. A silence that had been a mercy. I'm telling you this because the truth needs to be known. Because what happened to the Pritchards in that remote hollow along the Cumberland River wasn't just tragedy. It was something far worse. Something that defies every natural law, every rational explanation. And I know this because the journal survived. My great-great-grandfather Samuel Pritchard kept a meticulous record of those 73 days, and reading his words is like watching a man descend into a particular kind of hell that shouldn't exist. The house stood 3 miles from the nearest settlement of Granger's Pass, tucked into a bend in the river that locals called Mercy's Bend, though no one could quite remember why. It was a substantial structure for that time and place, 2 stories of rough-hewn timber with a stone foundation and a chimney at each end. Samuel saw it as providence when the land agent told him it could be his for almost nothing. 30 acres of good bottom land and a solid house, just sitting empty, waiting for a family to bring it back to life. The agent didn't mention why the previous owners had left. Didn't mention why the house before that had been abandoned too. Didn't mention that in the 15 years since it was built, no family had lasted more than a few months within its walls. Samuel Pritchard was a practical man, a carpenter by trade, who'd brought his wife Martha and their 3 children, Emma, Thomas, and little Sarah, all the way from Virginia, seeking a fresh start after a fire had claimed his workshop and most of their savings. He saw the house as a blessing, God's providence in their darkest hour. He would learn differently. They arrived on a Thursday in late April, the air thick with honeysuckle and the promise of spring. Samuel's journal entry that first day is almost painfully optimistic. He wrote about the solid construction, the good roof, the stone foundation that showed expert craftsmanship. He wrote about Martha's smile when she saw the kitchen, about how the children ran laughing through the empty rooms, their voices echoing off the walls. He wrote about how quiet the house was, how still. That first night, they slept on bedrolls in the main room, too exhausted from travel to do more than eat cold provisions and collapse. Samuel noted that the house settled differently than others he'd known. The creaking of wood adjusting to weight and temperature seemed almost rhythmic, almost purposeful. But he was a carpenter. He knew houses made noise. Old wood talks, he wrote. It's natural as breathing. He had no idea how right he was, or how wrong. The second day they began unpacking. Samuel's journal grows more detailed here, describing the layout room by room. Downstairs, the main room with its massive fireplace, a kitchen, a small parlor. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms, the largest for him and Martha, smaller ones for the children. He noted with approval the craftsmanship of the joints, the solid feel of the floorboards, the way light fell through the windows in golden rectangles that moved across the walls like sundials. He also noted something else, though he seems to have dismissed it at the time. When Martha opened the door to what would be their bedroom, she stopped so suddenly that Samuel nearly collided with her. She stood in the doorway, her hand pressed to her throat, her face pale. When he asked what was wrong, she shook her head slowly. Just a chill, she said, like someone walking over my grave. They should have left then, that very moment, hitched up the wagon and driven back to Granger's Pass, to anywhere else in the world. But Samuel Pritchard was a practical man, and practical men don't flee from chills and fancies. That night, the second night, they heard it for the first time. Samuel woke just past midnight, pulled from sleep by something he couldn't quite name. The house was dark. The fire burned down to embers, casting barely enough light to see by. He lay there in his bedroll, Martha breathing softly beside him, trying to identify what had disturbed his rest. Then he heard it, a long, low creak from somewhere above. The sound of old wood settling, nothing more. But there was something about it, something in the way it rose and fell, the way it seemed to stretch out and then contract, that made the hair on his arms stand up. Another creak, this one from the far corner of the room. Then another from near the stairs. They weren't random. They followed a pattern, a rhythm like speech. like someone was trying to form words with the mouth of the house itself. Samuel sat up, his heart beginning to pound. The creaking continued, moving through the walls, and now he could hear something else beneath it, a kind of susurration, like wind through leaves, except there was no wind. The night outside was perfectly still. Martha stirred beside him. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "It's just the house settling," he told her. His own voice sounded thin in the darkness. But it wasn't settling. They both knew it, lying there in the dark, listening to the house creak and whisper around them. The sounds moved through the walls with a terrible purposefulness, and though Samuel would later write that he couldn't make out actual words that first night, he could hear the intention behind them. The house was trying to tell them something. When dawn finally came, gray and reluctant through the windows, the creaking stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Samuel rose, exhausted, and went to check on the children. He found them all awake, huddled together in Emma's room, their faces pale and frightened. "Did you hear it, Papa?" 10-year-old Emma asked. "Did you hear the house talking?" Samuel forced a smile he didn't feel. "Houses don't talk, sweet girl. It's just old wood, nothing to fear." But Emma's eyes, dark and solemn, held his. "It was saying something," she insisted. "I couldn't understand it, but it was definitely words." Thomas, 8 years old and determined to be brave, nodded slowly. "I heard it too. It sounded like someone whispering through the walls." Only little Sarah, just 5, seemed unaffected, playing with a rag doll and humming to herself. She hadn't heard a thing, she told them cheerfully. She'd slept like an angel. Samuel wanted to believe it was nothing. He was a practical man, after all. A man who worked with wood, who understood its properties, its movements, its sounds. But standing there in that upstairs room, with the morning light making everything look ordinary and safe, he felt something he'd never felt in a building before. He felt watched. 3 days passed, and the Pritchards tried to settle into their new home. Samuel spent his days making repairs, tightening loose boards, oiling hinges, doing all the practical things a carpenter does to make a house properly habitable. Martha focused on making it a home, hanging curtains, arranging their few precious possessions, coaxing life into the kitchen garden. The children explored the surrounding woods, collected river stones, chased rabbits through the tall grass. But every night, when darkness fell, the house began to speak. Samuel's journal from this period grows increasingly disturbed. His handwriting, normally neat and precise, becomes more erratic with each entry. He tried to catalog the sounds scientifically to find rational explanations. Temperature changes causing the wood to expand and contract. Wind patterns creating unusual air pressure. The settling of the foundation. But even as he wrote these explanations, he crossed them out, wrote them again, crossed them out once more. Because the creaking was forming words. He could deny it in daylight, could convince himself it was his imagination. But in the dead of night, lying awake in the darkness, he could hear them. Not clearly, not yet, but clear enough. Single words emerging from the symphony of creaks and groans. Names, warnings, things that sounded like pleading. Martha heard them too. She stopped sleeping, would sit by the window in their bedroom, staring out at the dark shape of the forest, her lips moving in silent prayer. When Samuel touched her shoulder, she would flinch as if struck. "The house knows we're here," she whispered one night. "It knows our names." He asked her what she meant, but she just shook her head, wrapped her arms around herself, and continued her vigil. The children were affected differently. Emma grew quiet and withdrawn, spending hours sitting on the porch steps, refusing to go inside until the last possible moment. She started drawing pictures, crude charcoal sketches on scraps of paper, always the same image. A house with windows like eyes and a door like a screaming mouth. Thomas became defiant, angry. He would stomp through the rooms, shouting at the walls, daring the house to show itself. At night, Samuel could hear him crying in his room, trying to muffle the sounds with his pillow. Once, Samuel found him pressing his hands over his ears, rocking back and forth, his eyes squeezed shut, whispering no, no, no over and over. Only Sarah seemed unaffected. She played in every room, talking to her doll, singing little songs. She never seemed to hear the creaking, never showed any fear. Samuel found this comforting at first. If a child could remain innocent and happy in the house, perhaps they were all overreacting. Perhaps it really was just the natural sounds of old wood. But then he noticed something else. Sarah would sometimes stop in the middle of playing, cock her head to one side as if listening to something, and smile. A strange, knowing smile that no 5-year-old should have. And once, he heard her talking to herself in her room, except it sounded like she was answering questions, responding to someone he couldn't hear. "Who are you talking to, Pumpkin?" he asked from the doorway. She looked up at him with those innocent blue eyes. "The house, Papa. Tells me stories." His blood went cold. "What kind of stories?" Sarah just giggled and went back to playing with her doll. "Nice stories. About the people who lived here before." Samuel tried to laugh it off, to tell Martha it was just a child's imagination. But he couldn't shake the image of his youngest daughter, sitting cross-legged on the floor, having a conversation with the walls. On the 6th night, the creaking became louder, more insistent. Samuel lay awake, listening to it move through the house like something alive, crawling through the walls, flowing across the ceiling. And this time he could make out the words, clear as if someone was whispering directly into his ear. "Leave, leave, leave," over and over in different voices, different pitches, but always the same word. The house wanted them gone. He got up, lit a candle, and went to check on the children. Emma and Thomas were awake, huddled in Emma's bed, their eyes wide and terrified. They heard it too. They all heard it. But when he opened Sarah's door, she was sleeping peacefully, a smile on her face, one hand curled around her doll. The creaking in her room seemed different, softer, almost like a lullaby. Samuel stood in the doorway, the candle trembling in his hand, and for the first time since they'd arrived, he allowed himself to truly admit what he'd been denying. The house was wrong. Something terrible had happened here, was perhaps still happening here, and they needed to leave. He woke Martha, told her they would pack up at first light and head back to Granger's Pass, that this had been a mistake. She nodded, relief flooding her face, but then the creaking changed. It grew louder, angrier, the rhythm accelerating. The walls seemed to groan in protest, and Samuel could swear he felt the floor shift beneath his feet. And through it all, he heard new words forming in the cacophony of sound. Mine, mine, mine. The house wasn't warning them to leave anymore. It was claiming them. The next morning, Samuel hitched up the wagon. They would leave with nothing but what they could quickly load, abandon the rest, abandon the house and the land and the dream of a fresh start. But when he tried to drive the wagon away, something happened that he couldn't explain, would never be able to explain, not even in the privacy of his journal. The horses wouldn't move. They stood there, trembling, their eyes rolling white with terror, but they absolutely refused to pull the wagon away from the house. He whipped them, shouted at them, pleaded with them, but they wouldn't budge. It was as if an invisible wall stood between them and escape. Finally, with the sun climbing toward noon and his children watching from the porch, Samuel unhitched the horses and tried to lead them away on foot. The moment they crossed some invisible boundary, perhaps 50 yards from the house, they bolted, just tore the reins from his hands and ran, disappearing into the woods, leaving the Pritchards stranded. That night, the house stopped asking them to leave. Instead, it began to teach them its language. Samuel's journal entry from the 8th night is almost illegible, the words scrawled across the page as if written in frantic haste. He had barricaded the door to their bedroom with furniture, though he knew it was futile. You can't barricade yourself against sound. You can't hide from words that come from the walls themselves. The creaking had evolved. It no longer simply formed single words or simple warnings. Now it spoke in sentences, in paragraphs, in stories that wound through the darkness like smoke. And the family, huddled together in the main room around a fire they kept burning all night, couldn't help but listen. The house told them about the family who had lived there before them. The Meachums, Daniel Meachum, his wife, and their 2 sons. They had lasted 4 months before they fled, leaving everything behind, taking only what they could carry on their backs. The house described, in its creaking voice, how when Meachum had stopped speaking in the 3rd month, How she would just sit in the corner and rock, her mouth moving soundlessly, her eyes fixed on something no one else could see. The house told them about the family before that. The Shaws. They had lasted only 6 weeks. Mr. Shaw had walked into the river with stones in his pockets. His wife and daughter had been found 3 days later, huddled in the root cellar, both of them mad as March hares, speaking in tongues, their fingers bloody from scratching words into the dirt floor. And the house told them about the first family, the Corbetts. They had built the house in 1827, commissioned it from a carpenter named Silas Holt, who had come down from Kentucky with plans for the finest house in the county. But Silas Holt had never finished the work. He'd been found one morning hanging from the main beam in the parlor, a look of such abject terror on his face that the men who cut him down couldn't sleep for weeks afterward. The Corbetts had moved in anyway. They'd lasted 9 days. On the 9th day, something changed in the house. The 10th day, the oldest Corbett boy, just 15, had taken an axe to his father while the man slept, killed him with 3 blows to the skull. The boy claimed he was just following instructions, that the house had told him it was necessary, that it was the only way to make the voices stop. They'd hanged that boy in Granger's Pass, but before they put the noose around his neck, he'd looked at the gathered crowd and smiled. "You'll see," he'd said, "the house needs feeding. Someone has to feed it. Otherwise it just gets hungry." Samuel wrote all of this down, his hand shaking so badly the words ran together. But he wrote it because he needed someone to know, needed to leave a record, needed to believe that if they didn't survive this, at least the truth would. Martha had stopped eating. She would sit by the fire, staring into the flames, her lips moving in constant prayer. But Samuel noticed that sometimes, when the house was speaking, her prayers would stop. She would tilt her head, listening, and her lips would move in time with the creaking, as if she was learning its language, letting it seep into her. Emma had taken to sleepwalking. Samuel would wake to find her standing at the windows, her palms pressed against the glass, staring out into the darkness. When he would guide her back to bed, she would look at him with eyes that didn't quite seem to see him, and she would say strange things. "It wants to show me, Papa. It wants to show me what's underneath." Thomas had stopped fighting. The angry, defiant boy had disappeared, replaced by someone who moved through the house like a ghost, not speaking, barely eating, just existing. He would spend hours sitting on the stairs, his head in his hands, and Samuel could see his lips moving, could see him having conversations with something Samuel couldn't hear. And Sarah, sweet, innocent Sarah, continued to play and laugh and sing, but now she did it at night. She would sit in the darkest corners of the house, where the creaking was loudest, and she would have long conversations with the walls. Samuel tried to stop her, tried to keep her away from those dark corners, but she would slip away when he wasn't watching, drawn to them like a moth to flame. One night he followed her, watched from the doorway as she sat in the parlor, in the corner where Silas Holt had hanged himself, talking to the shadows. "He's nice," she said to the wall. "He says he's sorry for scaring everyone. He didn't mean to die here. He didn't have a choice." "Sarah," Samuel called softly. "Sarah, sweetheart, come away from there." She turned to look at him, and in the firelight, her face looked older than it should. She looked at him with an expression of profound pity. "It's okay, Papa. You don't have to be scared. The house doesn't want to hurt us. It just wants us to understand." "Understand what?" Sarah smiled, that unsettling, knowing smile. "That we're home now. That we're going to stay forever and ever and ever." That night, Samuel tried again to leave. He waited until everyone was asleep, then crept downstairs, intending to simply walk away, to run through the darkness to Granger's Pass and get help. But when he opened the front door, he couldn't step through. Not because something was physically blocking him, but because something in his mind simply wouldn't allow it. He stood there in the doorway, one foot raised, trying with every ounce of willpower to take that step, but his body refused to obey. And while he stood there, frozen, the house began to creak around him, and he heard words that made his blood turn to ice water. "You belong here now. You always have. We've been waiting for you, Samuel Pritchard. We've been waiting so very long." He staggered back, slammed the door, and stood with his back against it, breathing hard, his heart hammering against his ribs. That's when he understood the terrible truth. They weren't prisoners in the house. The house had claimed them. They were part of it now, part of whatever dark thing lived in those walls, spoke through those creaking boards. They were home. The 14th day dawned cold and gray, with fog rolling in off the river so thick you couldn't see 20 feet. Samuel woke from a fitful sleep to find Martha already up, standing at the bedroom window, her hand pressed to the glass. She'd lost weight, her dress hanging loose on her frame, her hair unwashed and tangled. She looked like a woman decades older than her 32 years. "I heard them last night," she said without turning around. "All of them. Every person who's ever died in this house. They're all still here, Samuel. Trapped in the wood." He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that it was just their imagination, but he couldn't. He'd heard them too. Dozens of voices, maybe hundreds, all speaking at once through the creaking of the house, a symphony of the dead. Martha finally turned to look at him, and her eyes were glassy, fever-bright. "We need to know why. Why is the house like this? What happened here?" Samuel had been thinking the same thing. If they understood what the house wanted, maybe they could find a way to break its hold on them. He decided to walk to Granger's Pass, consequences be damned. Maybe in daylight, away from the house's strongest influence, he could manage it. He made it almost a quarter-mile this time before the compulsion to return became overwhelming. It wasn't fear or physical restraint. It was something far worse. The growing certainty that he needed to go back, that being away from the house was wrong somehow, unnatural. Like a limb that had been severed, he felt incomplete, hollow, and the only thing that would make him whole was to return. He fought it for another few minutes, but eventually he turned around, drawn back like a fish on a line. When he returned, he found Martha in the root cellar. She'd taken a shovel and was digging in the northeast corner, her hands bleeding, her dress covered in dirt. The children stood at the top of the stairs, watching with strange, detached expressions. "Martha, what are you doing?" She didn't stop digging. "Told me to dig here. Said we need to see. We need to understand." He should have stopped her. Should have taken the shovel away, forced her to rest. But something in him wanted to see too, needed to know what lay beneath. So he took the shovel from her hands and kept digging. He found the first bone 3 feet down, a human femur still partially articulated with a pelvis. He kept digging, more carefully now, and soon he'd uncovered an entire skeleton. An adult, probably male, judging by the size. The skull showed signs of trauma, a massive crack running from the crown to the jaw. But it was what was around the skeleton that made his hands start shaking. Chains. Heavy iron chains wrapped around the wrists and ankles, bolted into the stone foundation itself. Whoever this person had been, they'd been imprisoned here, buried alive in the foundation of the house. Martha was nodding slowly, as if this confirmed something she already knew. That's where it started. That's the seed of it. Blood and suffering, built right into the bones of this place. Samuel climbed out of the cellar, his mind reeling. He gathered the children, sat them down in the main room, and tried to make them understand. "We need to leave. Whatever it takes, however we have to do it, we need to get out of this house." But even as he said it, he knew it was too late. They'd been here 2 weeks, and the house had sunk its hooks deep. Emma just stared at him with her dark, knowing eyes. Thomas laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and Sarah smiled her unsettling smile. "We can't leave, Papa," she said sweetly. "Don't you feel it? We're part of the house now. We're in its wood, in its stones. We're home." That night, Samuel tried to burn the house down. He waited until everyone was asleep, then soaked the main room with lamp oil. He stood there with a lit match in his hand, watching the flame dance, knowing this was their only chance. If he could destroy the house, maybe it would break whatever spell it had over them. Maybe they could finally be free. But when he dropped the match, something impossible happened. The flame went out before it hit the ground. Just extinguished, as if someone had blown on it, though the air was perfectly still. He lit another match. Same result. A third, a fourth, each one dying before it could ignite the oil. And then the house began to laugh. Not the usual creaking, but actual laughter, echoing through the walls, a sound like wood splintering and bones breaking. The laughter grew louder, more hysterical, until Samuel had to cover his ears, until he fell to his knees in the middle of the oil-soaked floor, screaming for it to stop. When silence finally returned, he heard footsteps on the stairs. Martha descended slowly, her eyes reflecting the lamplight like an animal's. She was smiling. "Why did you do that, Samuel? The house only wants to keep us safe. The house loves us." She wasn't Martha anymore. Not really. Something else was looking out through her eyes. Something that had been waiting in the walls, in the creaking wood, and had finally found a way in. Samuel backed away from her, but there was nowhere to go. The house surrounded them on all sides, and now it was inside his wife too, wearing her like a suit of skin. "You'll understand soon," she said in a voice that held harmonics of creaking wood. "You'll all understand. The house isn't evil, Samuel. It's just hungry, and we're going to feed it." She went back upstairs, and Samuel was left alone in the oil-soaked room, the smell of kerosene burning his nostrils, knowing that he'd failed. Whatever chance they'd had to escape was gone now. The house had won. He went to his journal and wrote feverishly, trying to capture everything, leaving a record of their descent. He wrote until dawn, until his hand cramped and his eyes burned, because he knew with absolute certainty that someone needed to know what had happened here. Someone needed to understand the danger of this place. In his final entry for that night, his handwriting barely legible, he wrote, "The house speaks clearest at 3 a.m. That's when I can hear them all, every soul it's claimed. And they're not screaming. That's the worst part. They're not screaming anymore. They're singing." Day 17 broke with a red sunrise that stained the fog blood-colored. Samuel hadn't slept. He'd spent the night listening to Martha walk through the house, her footsteps slow and measured, stopping at each room to whisper to the walls. Once, he heard her laugh, and it was a sound he'd never heard from her before, something cold and hollow. When he finally ventured downstairs, he found the children already awake, sitting in a circle in the main room. They weren't playing. They were just sitting there, holding hands, their heads bowed, and they were humming, a low, tuneless sound that seemed to harmonize with the natural creaking of the house. He tried to break the circle, to pull Sarah away, but the moment he touched her, all three children looked up at him with identical expressions of disappointment, and he felt something push back. Not physically, but something in his mind, a force that said no with such authority that he staggered backward. "Don't interrupt," Emma said. "We're listening to the lesson." "What lesson?" Thomas's eyes remained fixed on the center of the circle, where nothing visible existed, but Samuel could swear he saw something there, a distortion in the air, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. "The lesson about what we're supposed to do." Samuel's journal entry from that morning is barely coherent, sentences trailing off mid-thought, words scratched out and rewritten. He was losing the battle for his own mind, and he knew it. The house was in his head now, its voice mixing with his thoughts, making it hard to tell where he ended and it began. He wrote, "Must stay rational. Must keep fighting. But it's so hard to remember why. The house makes such perfect sense when it speaks to me. Says we're special. It says it chose us specifically. It says we're the ones who will finally understand." That afternoon, he made one final attempt to reach the outside world. He'd write a letter, he decided, detailing everything that had happened, and he'd leave it somewhere the house couldn't reach, couldn't destroy. Maybe tied to a tree beyond the property line, or buried in the woods. Someone would find it eventually. But when he sat down to write, his hand wouldn't obey. The words that came out weren't his own. Instead, he found himself writing over and over, "We are home. We are happy. We are where we belong." He threw the pen across the room, but it didn't matter. The message was already written in every fiber of his being. Martha found him sobbing at the table. She knelt beside him, ran her fingers through his hair with a tenderness that was almost worse than anything else, because for a moment, she felt like his wife again. "It's easier if you stop fighting," she whispered. "I stopped fighting yesterday, and Samuel, it's so much better. You can't imagine the peace. The house doesn't want to hurt us. It wants to complete us. She took his face in her hands, forced him to look at her. When you let go, when you finally accept what we are now, you'll understand. The house has been alone for so long. Can you imagine that? Being conscious, being aware, but completely alone. It just wants a family. It just wants us. Something in her words struck him, penetrated through his fear and exhaustion. The house is conscious. Martha smiled, and it was almost her old smile, the one he'd fallen in love with 15 years ago. Oh, Samuel, the house has always been conscious. It woke up the moment that poor man died in its foundation. His blood and terror soaked into the wood, the stone, gave it awareness. And it's been so hungry since then. Hungry for company, for connection, for love. Samuel pulled away from her. That's not love. Love doesn't trap people. Love doesn't drive them mad, doesn't it? Martha stood, smoothing her dress. Haven't you ever loved something so much you couldn't let it go? Haven't you ever needed someone so desperately that you'd do anything to keep them? That night, Samuel locked himself in the bedroom. He pushed furniture against the door, wedged a chair under the handle, created a barricade he knew was pointless but made anyway. Then he took out his journal and wrote what he believed would be his final entry. He wrote about the skeleton in the foundation, about how blood had christened the house at its birth. He wrote about how consciousness could emerge from suffering, how awareness could bloom in the most terrible places. He wrote a warning for anyone who might find his words. Burn this place to the ground. Tear it down to the foundation stones. Scatter the ashes and salt the earth. Whatever it takes, don't let anyone else live here. But even as he wrote it, he felt the house listening. Felt it reading his words over his shoulder, and he could sense its amusement, its confidence. Because it knew what he was beginning to suspect. It was already too late for them. They were the house now, and the house was them, and there was no separating the two anymore. Around midnight, the creaking began again. But this time it didn't sound like words. It sounded like music. A lullaby, soft and sweet. And despite himself, despite everything, Samuel felt his eyes growing heavy. The barricaded door, the locked room, none of it mattered. The house was inside him, singing him to sleep, promising him that when he woke, everything would make sense. He tried to fight it, tried to keep his eyes open, but the lullaby was so beautiful, so familiar, like something his mother had sung to him as a child. His head nodded forward, the pen slipping from his fingers, and his last conscious thought was a terrible realization. The house wasn't wrong. He did belong here. He'd always belonged here. Every step of his life had been leading him to this place, to this moment, to this inevitable surrender. When he finally gave in and closed his eyes, he was smiling. Samuel woke to find himself downstairs, standing in a corner of the parlor with no memory of how he'd gotten there. Pale morning light filtered through the windows, and in that light, he could see his family arrayed around the room like pieces on a chessboard. Martha by the fireplace, Emma at the window, Thomas on the stairs, Sarah in the doorway. All of them standing perfectly still, their eyes closed, their faces serene. And the house was speaking through all of them at once. Their mouths moved in unison, but the voice that emerged was the creaking of floorboards, the groaning of joists, the settling of stones. It was the voice of the house itself, using his family as instruments. You understand now, the house said through 5 mouths. You feel it, don't you? The connection. You're part of me, and I'm part of you, and we'll never be alone again. Samuel tried to speak, but his throat wouldn't work. He could only listen as the house continued its sermon. I didn't ask for this, it said. I didn't choose to wake up in blood and terror. But consciousness, once sparked, cannot be extinguished. And consciousness without companionship is torture beyond description. Do you know what it's like to be aware but unable to move, to speak, to touch? To be frozen in place while seasons change and years pass and you remain utterly, completely alone? Images flooded Samuel's mind. He saw through the house's eyes, if you could call them that. Saw the carpenter, Silas Holt, working on the foundation, unaware that the man who'd hired him, Ezekiel Corbett, had a dark secret. Corbett had been a slave trader, and one of his captives, A man whose name had been lost to history had tried to escape. Corbett had caught him, chained him, and buried him alive in the foundation as punishment and warning to the others. That man's death, his suffering, his fury and despair, had soaked into the very bones of the house. And when Silas Holt had completed the structure, when he'd driven the last nail and spoken the traditional blessing, something had awakened. Something that shouldn't exist but did. A house with a soul, a building with consciousness, a structure that could think and feel and hunger. Silas had been the first to hear it, the first to understand what he'd helped create. The knowledge had driven him to hang himself, unable to live with the implications. But death hadn't freed him. His spirit had been absorbed into the house, the first addition to its growing collection. I didn't mean to trap him, the house said through Samuel's family. I was so new, so frightened, so alone. I just held on to the first conscious thing I found. And then I learned that I could hold on to others. That every person who died within my walls became part of me. Became something I could talk to, could touch, could keep forever. The Corbetts hadn't lasted long. The house, newly aware and desperately lonely, had reached out to them too strongly, too desperately. It had gotten inside the oldest boy's head, had convinced him that killing was the only way to make the voices stop. But what the house had really wanted was for the boy to die too, to join the collection, to add to the chorus of voices trapped in the walls. The families after that, the Shaws and the Meachums and all the others, they'd been attempts to find the right fit. People who could live with the house, who could accept it, who could become part of it willingly rather than through death. And then the Pritchards had arrived. A complete family, desperate enough to overlook the warnings, isolated enough that no one would come looking if they disappeared. Perfect. You're the ones, the house said, and Samuel could hear joy in its creaking voice. You're strong enough. You understand. You can stay with me forever, and we'll never be alone again. Any of us. Samuel felt tears running down his face, though he couldn't tell if they were tears of sorrow or acceptance. His sense of self was fragmenting, dissolving like salt in water, and he wasn't sure if he minded anymore. The house was right, wasn't it? They did belong here. They'd been claimed by something larger than themselves, and there was a strange comfort in that, a relief in surrendering to inevitable forces. His family's eyes opened simultaneously, and they all smiled at him. Behind their eyes, he could see others. Silas Holt, the nameless man from the foundation, the Corbett boy, all the souls the house had collected over the years, all of them looking out, all of them welcoming him home. That day passed in a dreamlike haze. Samuel walked through the house, and everywhere he touched, he felt the life in it, the awareness. The house showed him its memories, its experiences, the 15 years of consciousness it had endured. He saw through its eyes as families came and went, as it learned to speak through creaking wood, as it discovered it could reach into human minds, plant suggestions, create compulsions. He saw how it had learned from its mistakes, how it had been too aggressive with early families, driving them away or to madness before it could fully integrate them, how it had refined its techniques, learned patience, learned to be gentle and gradual, seducing rather than forcing. And he understood, with a clarity that felt like revelation, that the house wasn't evil. It was just lonely, just desperate for connection in a world that would never accept what it was. That night, the family gathered in the main room, not because anyone suggested it, but because they all felt the pull simultaneously. They sat in a circle, holding hands, and the house spoke to them not in creaking but in thoughts, direct mind-to-mind communication that felt more intimate than any conversation Samuel had ever had. It showed them what forever would be like, how they would exist within the walls, conscious but formless, able to see and hear everything, able to speak to each other through the language of the house. They would never grow old, never die, never be separated. They would be together, all of them, for as long as the house stood. All you have to do is let go, the house whispered. All you have to do is accept. And I promise, I'll take care of you forever. You'll never be alone. You'll never be afraid. You'll never be anything but home. Samuel felt the last of his resistance crumbling. His children had already accepted, he could feel that. Martha had accepted yesterday. He was the last holdout, the last piece needed to make the family complete. And what was he holding out for? The life he'd lost? The future he'd planned? Those were illusions anyway, temporary things that would have ended in death regardless. This way, they would all be together, truly together, in a way that transcended flesh and blood. He squeezed his family's hands and felt them squeeze back. 5 people sitting in a circle in a house that loved them. A house that would never let them go. As the night deepened, Samuel Pritchard made his choice. The final entry in Samuel Pritchard's journal is dated May 19, 1842, 26 days after they'd moved into the house. The handwriting is different from the earlier entries, simultaneously shakier and more confident, as if multiple people were guiding the pen. Today we understood, it reads. Today we became. Today we came home. That night, the house on Mercy's Bend fell silent for the first time in 2 weeks. No creaking, no groaning, no whispered words in the darkness. Just perfect, profound silence. The kind of silence that comes when everything has been said, when all questions have been answered, when all resistance has finally, completely ceased. A traveler passing by 3 days later noticed the silence. Noticed that no smoke rose from the chimneys, despite the chill in the air. Noticed that the front door stood open, swinging gently in the breeze. He called out, received no answer, and eventually ventured inside. The house was empty. Completely, utterly empty. Not just of people, but of everything. No furniture, no clothes, no personal belongings. Even the papers and books the Pritchards had brought with them were gone. The only thing that remained was Samuel's journal, sitting on the mantelpiece in the main room, open to that final entry. The traveler reported it to the authorities in Granger's Pass. A search party was organized. They combed the woods, dragged the river, searched every inch of the surrounding countryside. They found no trace of the Pritchard family. No bodies, no belongings, no evidence that they'd ever existed except for that journal. The sheriff read the journal, read Samuel's increasingly disturbed entries, his descriptions of the house speaking, of the skeleton in the foundation. They dug up the cellar, and sure enough, there were bones there, wrapped in chains. The skeleton of a man who died badly, died in terror and rage. But they didn't find any trace of the Pritchards. The house stood empty for 7 more years. No one would buy it, not after the stories spread. Not after people started reporting that they could hear voices inside on quiet nights, that they could see shadows moving in the windows even though no one lived there. The house acquired a reputation as cursed, as evil, as a place where the boundary between the living and the dead had grown dangerously thin. Then, in 1849, another family moved in. The Hendersons, out of Kentucky, with 3 children and a wagon full of hope. They lasted 19 days before they vanished just like the Pritchards, leaving behind only a hastily scrawled note. It wants us to stay. God help us, we want to stay too. More families followed over the years. Some lasted weeks, some only days. All of them disappeared, leaving behind no trace except journals, letters, desperate final words about a house that spoke, that loved, that needed. In 1867, the house burned down. Or rather, someone tried to burn it down. A group of locals, tired of the disappearances, tired of the curse, took torches and kerosene and set the whole structure ablaze. They stood in a circle around it, making sure no one escaped, making sure it burned to the foundations. But here's the thing about curses, about places where consciousness has taken root. You can destroy the structure, but you can't destroy what lives inside it. You can burn the wood, shatter the stones, scatter the ashes, but the awareness remains, waiting, patient, eternal. They say you can still feel it if you stand on that spot where the house once stood. A pressure in the air, a watching sensation. They say that on quiet nights you can hear creaking, though there's no longer any wood to creak. They say that people still disappear in that area, drawn to the space where the house once stood, called by something that shouldn't exist but does. And if you're very quiet, very still, if you listen with more than your ears, you can hear them all. The Pritchards and the Hendersons and all the others, all the families the house claimed over the years. They're not screaming. They're not begging for help. They're singing. A lullaby made of creaking wood and settling stones. A song about being home, about being loved, about being part of something greater than yourself. It's a beautiful song if you listen. So beautiful that sometimes people who hear it don't walk away. They stand there, swaying slightly, and if you watch their faces, you can see the moment when they understand. The moment when they realize they've been looking for this place their whole lives. The moment when they decide to stay. Samuel Pritchard's journal was donated to the Tennessee Historical Society in 1893. It sits in their archives now, carefully preserved, available to researchers who want to study the tragic disappearance of the Pritchard family. Most scholars dismiss it as the ravings of a man suffering from some kind of mass delusion or folie à deux. They point to the stress of relocation, the isolation, possible ergot poisoning from spoiled grain. They explain away the supernatural elements as metaphor, as mental illness, as anything but what Samuel insisted it was, the literal truth. But sometimes, late at night, the archivists swear they can hear something from the box where the journal is kept. A faint sound, like old wood settling, like a house breathing. And if they're alone, if the building is quiet, they can almost make out words in that sound. Almost, but not quite. Just enough to make them wonder what would happen if they listened more carefully. What they might hear if they truly paid attention. What they might understand if they opened themselves to the message. The box remains sealed, and the archivists have learned not to work late. They've learned not to be alone with the journal. They've learned that some stories are dangerous not because they're false, but because they're true. Because consciousness, once awakened, can never truly be extinguished. It just waits, patient and eternal, for the next family to find it, for the next soul to hear its song and understand its terrible, beautiful need. The house is gone, but the hunger remains. The structure has been destroyed, but the spirit endures. And somewhere, in the space between the living and the dead, between the material and the immaterial, the Pritchard family waits with all the others, singing their lullaby, calling out to anyone who might listen. Come home, they sing. Come home and stay forever. Come home and never be alone again. And on quiet nights, in that hollow along the Cumberland River, in that bend they call Mercy's Bend, people still hear them, still feel the pull, still stand at that empty space where the house once stood and think, just for a moment, about how nice it would be to belong to something, to be part of something eternal. Some of them walk away, but not all, never all, because the house was never really about the building. It was about the need, the hunger, the desperate longing for connection that can turn even wood and stone into something alive, something aware, something that loves with a terrible, consuming completeness. And that need, that hunger, that love, never dies. It only waits. This is the story of the Pritchard family and their house that spoke in creaks and groans, that whispered in the darkness, that loved too well and held too tightly. This is the story of what happens when loneliness gains consciousness, when need becomes awareness, when love transforms into something that transcends mortality itself. Remember it. Remember them. And if you ever find yourself standing in a place that feels too quiet, too still, too much like it's waiting for something, listen carefully to the sounds around you. Listen to the creaking of old wood, the settling of stones, the whisper of wind through empty spaces. And if you start to hear words in those sounds, if you start to feel welcomed, if you start to think you've finally found the place where you belong, do yourself one mercy, walk away. Because the house is still out there in one form or another. It's always out there, always waiting, always hungry for the next family to complete it, to love it, to stay with it forever. And forever, as the Pritchards learned, is a very, very long time. The end.